"Excuse me, young lady," Helen, the flight attendant, said firmly but with a thin veil of politeness. "First class is for paying passengers only." Ava Carter, a young black girl, blinked in disbelief, her composure briefly shaken. She glanced at the boarding pass in her hand, and then back at Helen. "I am a first-class passenger," Ava responded, her voice steady but soft. "Here's my ticket. There must be some kind of mistake." Helen crossed her arms, her tone unyielding. "You don't belong here. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to call security," she warned, her voice growing sharper. What Helen didn't know was that Ava wasn't just another teenager. She was the daughter of the airline's CEO and was about to expose the prejudice Helen had carried for years. As we dive into this story, share where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. The airport buzzed with life. Travelers hurried through terminals, the rhythmic sound of rolling suitcases echoing across the polished floors. Overhead, announcements crackled from the intercom, while snippets of laughter and excited chatter filled the air as families set off on adventures. Amid the crowd, Ava Carter stood out, not because she sought attention, but because of the quiet confidence she carried. Holding her first-class boarding pass tightly, the poised and composed teenager waited patiently, her excitement tempered by a natural shyness. Today was monumental for Ava. This flight wasn't just a routine trip, it marked a milestone in her life. She had recently completed her studies after earning a prestigious scholarship to attend college in the United States. Dressed in a sleek and understated outfit that reflected her effortless elegance, Ava made her way through the exclusive first-class lounge. The space was designed for comfort and luxury. Plush leather chairs, soft lighting, and gentle jazz music playing in the background. Around her, travelers sipped cappuccinos, read newspapers, and tapped away on their laptops. Ava chose a seat by the window and placed her coffee and phone on the small table in front of her. She couldn't resist glancing at her boarding pass for the 100th time, not because she doubted herself, but because the reality of the moment filled her with quiet anticipation. This wasn't about showing off. Ava knew she had every right to enjoy the privilege of first class. As she scrolled through her phone, a message popped up from her father, Marcus Carter. "Boarding soon. Let me know once you're settled." Ava smiled softly and replied, "Almost there. I'll text you when I'm on board. Everything's fine." Marcus Carter wasn't just a proud dad. He was also the owner of Skyreach Airlines, the very company Ava was flying with. Yet despite his success, Marcus had always been a man of humility. Ava had grown up watching her father treat everyone, from custodians to executives, with the same unwavering respect. It was a quality she deeply admired. Few people knew Ava was his daughter. Marcus preferred to keep his family life private, and Ava appreciated that discretion. She glanced out at the planes parked on the tarmac, her mind wandering. It had been over 2 years since she'd been home. While she cherished her independence at school, she couldn't deny that she missed her family, especially her father. This flight wasn't just a journey. It was a homecoming, a celebration, a chance to reflect on how far she'd come. Boarding was announced, and Ava gathered her carry-on, excitement bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She made her way toward the gate, standing in the first-class line. Little did she know, trouble awaited her on that plane. And Helen, the flight attendant, had no idea how much her prejudice was about to cost her. As Ava approached the plane, she noticed 2 flight attendants chatting near the service counter. One of them, a woman with sharp features and a tightly wound bun, glanced in Ava's direction. Helen Sanders, the lead flight attendant, leaned closer to her colleague and smirked. "First class is getting too accessible," Helen muttered under her breath. Her tone carried a superiority that wasn't lost on her coworker, who responded with a nervous chuckle but said nothing. The boarding process continued. Helen stood at the gate, scanning passengers' tickets with a professional smile. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly to an older white man in a tailored suit. To another woman clutching an expensive handbag, Helen chirped, "Enjoy your flight." But when Ava reached the front of the line, Helen's demeanor shifted ever so slightly. Her eyes flicked to the ticket Ava handed over. It clearly stated first class, yet Helen's smile grew tight, her gaze narrowing. There must be a mistake, Helen said, forcing a saccharine tone. Economy is just down the aisle. Ava blinked, startled. My ticket says first class, she replied, holding it up for Helen to see. Helen didn't budge. Well, she said, her voice carrying a dismissive edge, head to economy anyway, and we'll sort it out there. Passengers behind Ava began to shift impatiently, their murmurs growing louder. Ava could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her voice calm. There's no mistake, she said firmly. This is my seat in first class. Helen leaned in slightly, her tone dropping to a warning. Look, I don't want to hold up the line. If you just head to economy, we can avoid a scene. The tension at the gate was palpable, but Ava held her ground. As whispers began to ripple through the crowd, neither she nor Helen could anticipate just how far this confrontation would go, or who would come out on top. Ava blinked, her confusion turning to resolve. This ticket says first class, she repeated, holding it up for Helen to inspect. Helen's expression didn't waver. There must be a mistake. Please proceed to economy, she insisted, her tone still outwardly polite, but laced with thinly veiled dismissal. Ava's fingers tightened around the handle of her carry-on, but her voice remained composed. There's no mistake, she said quietly. This is my seat. Behind her, passengers began to shuffle and sigh impatiently, their murmurs filling the gate area. Helen leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a pointed whisper. Look, let's not cause a scene. Just head to economy so we can keep things moving. Have you ever been judged unfairly because someone assumed you didn't belong? What would you do in Ava's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you love stories about standing up for what's right. Refusing to back down, Ava stepped past Helen and onto the plane, her posture unshaken. She could feel Helen's eyes following her, a flicker of annoyance on the flight attendant's face. Ava reached her assigned seat in first class, a comfortable and spacious chair with an air of calm sophistication. Placing her carry-on in the overhead bin, she adjusted the window shade slightly before settling in. Moments later, Helen entered the cabin, her sharp heels clicking against the polished floor. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor, Helen prided herself on maintaining strict order in her domain. Her eyes scanned the rows of passengers before landing on Ava, sitting quietly by the window. Helen approached with a practiced mask of professionalism. Excuse me, young lady, she began, her tone controlled but firm. First class is reserved for paying passengers. Ava blinked, momentarily stunned. I am a first-class passenger, she replied, her voice steady and calm. She extended her boarding pass to Helen, fully expecting the misunderstanding to be resolved. But Helen didn't take the ticket. Instead, she crossed her arms and gave Ava a skeptical look. I don't think so, she said dismissively. Step aside while I sort this out. The words hit Ava like a slap. For a moment she stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Around her, whispers began to spread among the other passengers. Those in economy glanced her way with pity or judgment, while others in first class shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to make of the scene. Helen wasn't finished. Taking a step forward, she said sharply, Let me see your ticket again. Are you sure you didn't take someone else's by mistake? Ava's hands trembled slightly as she held out the ticket once more. It's mine, she said firmly. This is my ticket. Helen's eyebrow arched, her voice dripping with doubt. Your father bought this for you? She asked. And where is he now? Ava met her gaze evenly. He's waiting for me at our destination, she replied. Helen let out a small, disbelieving scoff, glancing around as though seeking validation from the nearby passengers. I'm going to need to verify this, she said curtly. Wait here. Ava sat quietly, the knot of humiliation tightening in her chest. Around her, the murmurs grew louder. Some passengers looked at her with sympathy, while others exchanged judgmental glances. No one stepped forward to question what was happening. Ava felt the sting of isolation, but her father's voice echoed in her mind. Always carry yourself with dignity, even when others don't. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but Ava refused to let them fall. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself of who she was. Ava Carter, daughter of a man who had built an empire with integrity and respect. No one could take her dignity from her, not even Helen. Helen returned a few minutes later, her voice deliberately loud as she addressed Ava. Excuse me, she began, her tone sharper now. I need to ask you to move to economy. This seat has been assigned to someone else." Several passengers turned their heads at the commotion, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Ava calmly retrieved her boarding pass again, holding it up without a word. "This is my seat," she said firmly. "How can it be assigned to someone else?" Helen crossed her arms, the polite facade slipping away entirely. "If you don't comply, I'll have to escalate this and call security," she said, her voice hard and unyielding. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Ava met Helen's gaze with quiet determination. This was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was a standoff. Whispers spread like wildfire. Across the aisle, a businessman leaned toward his companion and muttered, "Looks like someone's trying their luck." Meanwhile, an older woman frowned, her expression disapproving. "This doesn't seem right," she murmured under her breath. But not everyone was on Ava's side. A man seated a few rows back muttered, "If she doesn't belong here, the attendant has every right to question her." Helen, determined to assert her authority, refused to back down. Little did she know, Ava wasn't just fighting for her seat. She was about to teach Helen a lesson she would never forget. Seated a few rows back, a man muttered under his breath, "Well, if she doesn't belong here, the attendant has every right to question her." Helen, determined to assert her authority and unwilling to back down, made the ultimate decision. She called security. Minutes later, 2 security officers boarded the plane, their presence casting a heavy silence over the cabin. The tension among the passengers was palpable as the officers made their way to Ava's seat. Their expressions were professional but firm as they addressed her. Ava, maintaining her composure, calmly explained the situation, holding up her boarding pass. "This is my assigned seat," she said, her voice steady as she defended her right to remain in first class. The officers hesitated, glancing between Ava and Helen. But Helen, eager to enforce her narrative, nodded sharply, her face smug with vindication. "Her seat is in economy," Helen said firmly, as though her word was final. Despite Ava's protests and the validity of her ticket, the officers deferred to Helen's authority. They escorted Ava down the aisle to economy. The whispers and stares of passengers followed her as she walked, her steps steady, but the humiliation unmistakable. Back in first class, Helen returned with a triumphant air, a self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She leaned toward a fellow flight attendant, her voice loud enough to be overheard. "That's how you deal with troublemakers," she said, tossing a glance around the cabin. Then, with an extra dose of smugness, she added, "First class is for people who belong here." In economy, Ava settled into her new seat, her back straight and her face calm despite the sting of injustice. Passengers craned their necks to watch, their reactions mixed. Some were indifferent, others sympathetic, and a few wore smug expressions, satisfied with what they believed to be justice served. Meanwhile, Helen strutted through the first-class cabin, her voice carrying as she made a pointed remark. "That girl doesn't even look like she belongs in first class, yet she's trying to claim it. This cabin is for people who belong here." Her tone dripped with arrogance, and though a few passengers chuckled politely, others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing her words were unprofessional and unfair. In the quiet hum of the economy cabin, Ava sat upright, her expression composed. Outwardly, she seemed calm, but inside, frustration gnawed at her. She glanced down at her phone, where an unsent message to her father still sat on the screen. "This isn't right, Dad. Why didn't they believe me?" She hesitated, her finger hovering over the send button. She knew that if she sent the message, her father would act swiftly and likely not discreetly. For now, Ava chose to stay calm. It wasn't easy. She could feel the weight of Helen's judgment in every dismissive look and every skeptical remark. It wasn't just the humiliation of being questioned, it was the underlying message that she didn't belong, that she wasn't enough. But Ava wouldn't let those feelings consume her. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin, determined to hold her dignity even as the whispers around her grew louder. Back in first class, a younger flight attendant hesitantly approached Helen, her expression uncertain. "Why did you move that girl?" she asked quietly. Helen shrugged, her tone dismissive and smug. She thought she could just walk in and claim whatever she wanted, she replied loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It takes experience to see through that kind of nonsense." I had to put her where she rightly belongs." Some passengers chuckled uncomfortably, but others exchanged uneasy glances, clearly disapproving of Helen's words. Meanwhile, Ava remained composed despite the humiliation she had endured. The first-class ticket, once a source of pride and validation, now felt like a cruel joke. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she typed a message to her father. "Dad, they moved me to economy. The flight attendant claimed my seat was a mistake." The reply came almost instantly. Her father's words were short and direct, filled with quiet reassurance. "Stay calm. I'll handle it. Let me know if anything else happens." Ava stared at the screen for a moment, her father's unwavering support giving her the strength she needed. She took a deep breath, slipping her phone back into her bag. For now, she would wait, trusting that her father's intervention would come at the right time. Later, Ava got up to stretch her legs and headed toward the bathroom at the back of the plane. As she waited, she heard a soft voice behind her. "I saw what happened earlier." Ava turned to see an older woman, her expression filled with concern and quiet indignation. "That wasn't right," the woman said softly. "You didn't deserve to be treated like that. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." For a moment, Ava was caught off guard by the woman's kindness. She offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I appreciate it, but I'll be okay." The woman nodded, placing a gentle hand on Ava's arm. "You're handling this with so much grace. It's more than most people could manage." She gave Ava an encouraging smile before returning to her seat. Ava sat back down, the weight of the situation pressing on her. The humiliation was fresh, but so was her determination. She knew her father was taking action, and all she could do now was wait. Ava sat in her cramped economy seat, her breathing steady, but her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. She stared out the small window, watching the endless clouds stretch across the horizon, trying to distract herself from the unfairness that had tailed her since she stepped onto the plane. After a few moments, Ava decided to do something simple, something to reclaim a small sense of control. She pressed the small call button above her seat, the soft chime barely audible over the ambient hum of the plane. Then she leaned back slightly, waiting patiently for someone to respond. Minutes passed. Ava noticed flight attendants moving up and down the aisle, tending to other passengers with quiet efficiency, but none of them came to her row. Finally, Helen appeared, making her way toward Ava's section. Her polished appearance remained intact, but there was a distinct edge to her movements. She stopped abruptly beside Ava's row, her voice sharp and devoid of warmth. "Yes?" Helen asked, the word more demand than question. Ava looked up, meeting her gaze with quiet politeness. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" she asked, her tone calm and measured. Helen's response was immediate but curt. She offered a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sure," she said, her clipped tone barely masking her indifference. Without waiting for a reply, she turned on her heel and walked away. Ava watched Helen retreat toward first class, her movements deliberate. The flight attendant didn't look back. Ava glanced at her watch, her calm expression faltering slightly. Minutes passed, 5, 10, but no water arrived. Her eyes tracked Helen as she moved through the first-class cabin, meticulously serving drinks to the passengers there. Helen's demeanor seemed almost performative. She smiled warmly at first-class travelers, exchanged pleasantries, and ensured everyone's needs were met. The exaggerated care she showed felt like a pointed contrast to her earlier indifference. The deliberate nature of Helen's actions wasn't lost on Ava. With her patience wearing thin, she pressed the call button again. This time, the soft chimes sounded louder in her ears, almost mocking her. Helen eventually returned to the economy section, her steps slower, her movements reluctant. When she stopped by Ava's row, her expression carried something resembling annoyance. "Yes?" Helen asked again, her tone sharp enough to make nearby passengers glance up. Ava kept her voice calm, though it took effort. "I requested water earlier," she said. "Could I have it now?" For a moment, Helen said nothing. Then, the tight-lipped smile returned to her face, a deliberate, insincere gesture. "I'll get to it," she replied, her tone dripping with indifference. Before Ava could respond, Helen turned and disappeared back into first class. Ava's calm facade began to crack. The deliberate hostility was undeniable now, and the sting of humiliation settled deeper in her chest. She glanced around, wondering if anyone else noticed what was happening. Were they ignoring it, or was she truly alone in this? Her eyes dropped to her phone, still glowing with her father's earlier message. "Stay calm. I'll handle it. Let me know if anything else happens." Ava tapped the screen, her fingers moving with quiet urgency. She began typing, the words spilling out in a mix of frustration and determination. "Dad, the flight attendant is targeting me. She's deliberately ignoring my requests and making me feel unwelcome. It's becoming unbearable." Ava stared at the message for a brief moment, her emotions swirling as she hovered over the send button. Finally, with a deep breath, she pressed send. The finality of the action brought her both relief and frustration. Her father's reply came almost immediately, as it always did. "Stay where you are. I'm making the call now." The response was short, but carried weight. Ava knew her father wasn't one to let things slide. If he said he was making a call, he meant business. Taking another deep breath, Ava sat back in her seat, trying to steady herself. She glanced around at the other passengers, wondering if anyone would speak up. Some offered her sympathetic glances, but most kept their heads down, lost in their own worlds. For now, all Ava could do was wait. She trusted her father, and if he said he'd handle it, she believed him. Ava sat quietly, her composure holding steady as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She couldn't help but glance around, wondering if any of the other passengers had noticed the way she was being treated. Her eyes caught a few sympathetic glances, but that was it. The silence of their inaction felt almost as isolating as Helen's behavior. Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet movement nearby. A young girl seated in the economy section approached her. The girl's expression was kind but carried a quiet determination. Leaning in slightly, the girl spoke softly but firmly. "That flight attendant's always awful to black passengers. She thinks we don't belong and could never afford first-class tickets. It's not right. I hope she gets what's coming to her," the girl said, her voice tinged with quiet outrage. Ava blinked, her composure faltering slightly in the face of the girl's sincerity. After a moment, she replied softly, "Thank you. She'll definitely be getting what's coming to her today." Ava's voice was calm but carried a note of emotion. She offered the girl a small, grateful smile. "I appreciate that," she said, her tone genuine. "But I'll be okay. Thank you for speaking up. It means a lot." The girl nodded, leaving Ava with a flicker of warmth in the midst of the tension. As the girl walked back to her seat, Ava refocused on the situation at hand. Her father had said he was making the call. All she could do now was wait. Midway through the flight, as the plane cruised high above the clouds, the calm hum of the cockpit was interrupted by the sound of the secure line ringing. The captain, a seasoned professional with years of experience, picked up the receiver, his expression neutral, as he continued scanning the instruments. But as the voice on the other end spoke, the captain's demeanor shifted. His brow furrowed slightly and his posture straightened. The voice belonged to Marcus Carter, the owner of the airline. Despite the calm and measured tone, there was no mistaking the authority behind his words. The instructions Marcus gave were clear and deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. "Yes, sir," the captain replied, his voice steady but carrying a newfound urgency. "Understood." The conversation was brief, lasting no more than a minute, but its impact lingered long after the call ended. As the captain placed the receiver back in its cradle, he exhaled slowly. He knew that when someone like Marcus Carter made a call mid-flight, it wasn't a casual inquiry, it was a direct intervention. After a moment of thought, the captain activated the intercom, summoning the lead flight attendant. Helen, still in the first-class cabin, was in the middle of a boastful conversation with her colleague when she felt a tap on her shoulder. Startled, she turned to find the captain standing behind her. His face was composed, but the serious expression immediately demanded her attention. Helen's initial annoyance at being interrupted quickly gave way to apprehension. "Miss Sanders," the captain said, his tone firm and controlled, "I need to speak with you." Helen straightened her posture, trying to maintain her usual air of confidence. "Of course," she said crisply. "What's the matter?" The captain wasted no time. "I've just received a call from Mr. Marcus Carter," he began, pausing to let the name sink in. Helen's brow furrowed, her confidence wavering for the first time. "Marcus Carter?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the captain confirmed, his tone steady. "The owner of the airline. He's been informed about an incident involving his daughter on this flight." At the mention of Ava, Helen's face paled. The pieces began to fall into place, and the realization hit her like a cold wave. The narrative she had carefully constructed about handling troublemakers suddenly felt flimsy and indefensible. The captain continued, his voice firm and final. "Mr. Carter has instructed me to inform you that he will be meeting the plane personally upon landing. He expects a full explanation, and from now on, he wants you to ensure his daughter is treated with the respect and care she deserves." For a moment, Helen stood frozen, her mind racing. The color drained from her face as the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. I didn't realize," she stammered, her usual sharpness replaced by hesitation. The captain's expression didn't change. "That's irrelevant," he said flatly. "What matters is how this situation was handled." Helen's bravado cracked under the pressure. She nodded stiffly, her throat dry as she managed to say, "Understood." The captain turned and walked back to the cockpit, leaving Helen rooted in place. The confidence she had so proudly displayed throughout the flight was now a distant memory. Helen muttered under her breath, almost as if trying to reassure herself. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, but her words lacked conviction. Unease gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing minute. For the rest of the flight, Helen's demeanor was noticeably subdued. Her steps, once brisk and purposeful, were slower and more hesitant. Her usual sharp remarks were replaced by silence. Passengers and crew alike couldn't help but notice the change. Whispers spread among those who had observed her earlier behavior, their tones ranging from curiosity to quiet satisfaction. Helen, however, avoided making eye contact with anyone. Her thoughts were consumed by one thing: the confrontation waiting for her upon landing. Helen's brisk steps through the cabin were now slow and hesitant. The smug confidence that had defined her earlier demeanor was gone, replaced by a tense silence. Passengers who had observed her behavior earlier couldn't help but notice the shift. Whispers rippled through the cabin, their tones varying from curiosity to quiet satisfaction. Helen avoided making eye contact with anyone, her mind consumed by one relentless thought: the confrontation awaiting her upon landing. What do you think will happen to Helen after the plane lands? Will she face the consequences of her actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below and hit the subscribe button if this story has you hooked. For Helen Sanders, the moments following the captain's announcement were harrowing. The revelation that Ava Carter was the daughter of Marcus Carter, the airline's owner, had shaken her to her core. Every step she took through the cabin felt heavier, her once assured confidence now replaced with nervous hesitation. The captain's words echoed in her mind like a relentless warning. He will be meeting the plane personally upon landing. Helen tried to carry on with her duties. She picked up a tray to offer refreshments, but her hands trembled slightly. Approaching a first-class passenger, she forced a smile, but her voice faltered as she asked, "Would you like a drink?" The passenger frowned, confused by her sudden change in tone, but nodded and accepted the drink without comment. Her colleagues, used to Helen's assertive demeanor, exchanged curious glances. Her sharpness had disappeared, replaced by visible unease. Her hands fumbled as she collected empty glasses, and she avoided eye contact with the passengers. Whispers began circulating among the crew and passengers. "What's wrong with her?" one colleague asked another. "She looks like she's seen a ghost," another replied. But Helen's distraction wasn't just internal, it began affecting her work. She misread passenger requests, served items to the wrong rows, and forgot orders she had just taken. Passengers noticed her repeated trips to the galley, where she lingered longer than necessary, gripping the counters as if trying to steady herself. The confidence she once exuded had completely vanished. Helen eventually reached a breaking point. She glanced toward the economy section, where Ava sat with an air of quiet composure, scrolling through her phone. A faint, knowing smile played on Ava's lips, and Helen's stomach tightened. The thought of Marcus Carter boarding the plane and confronting her directly filled Helen with dread. Desperate to salvage the situation, she swallowed her pride, grabbed a tray, and made her way toward Ava's seat. Her heart pounded with every step, each one feeling heavier than the last. Stopping beside Ava's row, Helen cleared her throat awkwardly. "Miss Carter," she began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Can I get you anything? A drink, a snack, perhaps a hot towel?" Ava looked up, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "No, thank you," she replied politely, her tone calm but distant. Helen hesitated, the forced smile on her face slipping slightly. "Are you sure? Anything at all? Please, just let me know." Ava shook her head, her composure unbroken. "I'm fine." The rejection stung, but Helen wasn't ready to give up. Over the next hour, she made repeated trips to Ava's row, offering everything she could think of. Extra blankets, premium snacks, even a meal upgrade. Each time, Ava declined. Her responses were unfailingly polite, yet firm. The other passengers watched the interactions unfold with growing curiosity. Whispers filled the cabin as they speculated about Helen's sudden change in behavior. "She's never this attentive," one passenger murmured. "Something must have happened," another added, shaking their head. "She's practically falling over herself." Ava wasn't surprised. She knew the shift in Helen's attitude wasn't motivated by genuine remorse. It was driven by fear. Each time Helen approached, Ava met her with the same composed smile, silently reminding the flight attendant that her efforts to undo the damage were futile. Eventually, Helen abandoned the tray altogether. She approached Ava empty-handed, her expression strained and her usual air of authority replaced by desperation. Lowering herself slightly to Ava's eye level, she cleared her throat. "Miss Carter," she began, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier. It was a misunderstanding on my part. I didn't realize." Helen's voice trailed off, unsure of how to finish without incriminating herself further. She looked down, visibly uncomfortable. I hope we can just put this behind us." Ava studied her for a moment, her calm demeanor unshaken. Then, with measured words, she replied, "The matter is no longer in my hands." Helen blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice faltering. Ava met her gaze, her tone steady but firm. "My father is handling it now. He's the one who will decide whether or not you're forgiven." Helen's face fell, her earlier composure crumbling. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of Ava's statement hung in the air, leaving no room for negotiation. For the first time, Helen truly understood the gravity of her actions, and that the consequences were entirely out of her control. Ava turned her attention back to her phone, a subtle but clear signal that the conversation was over. Helen stood there for a moment longer, her thoughts racing, before retreating to the galley. The passengers who had been watching the exchange whispered among themselves, their curiosity and speculation growing. For Ava, however, the situation was clear. She had endured humiliation and hostility, but the balance of power had shifted. As she glanced out the window at the soft glow of the clouds below, a faint smile crossed her lips. This was only the beginning. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. But many had noticed unusual activity outside. Through the windows, they saw a sleek black SUV pull up directly beside the aircraft, its polished surface gleaming under the airport lights. The door opened, and Marcus Carter, the owner of the airline, stepped out. His commanding presence turned heads instantly, and the fact that he was flanked by two senior executives made it clear that this was no ordinary visit. Inside the plane, whispers began almost immediately. "Who's that?" one passenger asked, nudging their seatmate. "He looks important." "That's Marcus Carter," another murmured, their eyes widening. "He owns the airline. What's he doing here?" Marcus ascended the aircraft stairs with a purposeful stride, his expression calm but serious. As he entered the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned toward him. He scanned the rows briefly, his gaze landing on Ava, seated in economy. His expression softened as he walked straight to her. The lines of tension on his face eased momentarily when he reached her. Marcus crouched slightly to meet her eye level, his voice warm and gentle as he broke the silence. "Are you all right?" he asked, his concern evident. Ava looked up at him, her composed exterior briefly betraying a flicker of relief. "I'm okay," she replied, though her tone carried traces of lingering frustration. "It's just been a lot. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over now," he said softly. "You won't have to deal with this any longer." Straightening, Marcus's expression shifted. The warmth he reserved for his daughter disappeared, replaced by a calm but commanding authority. He turned his attention to Helen, who stood frozen at the front of the cabin. Helen's face was pale, her usual sharpness completely absent. The realization that Marcus Carter had come for her was written all over her features. "Miss Sanders," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured, "I understand there was an issue with my daughter's seat." Helen's composure crumbled entirely. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally she stammered, I didn't know she was your daughter, sir. It was a misunderstanding." Marcus's gaze remained fixed on her, unflinching. His tone didn't rise, but the weight of his words was unmistakable. "The issue isn't whether or not you knew she was my daughter," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "The issue is how you treated her, and how you likely treat others who don't meet your assumptions." Helen's face reddened. She tried to respond, but her words tumbled out incoherently. "I didn't mean to. I didn't realize." Marcus raised a hand slightly, silencing her attempts at justification. "Your behavior today has been nothing short of unacceptable," he continued, addressing not only Helen, but the entire cabin. "This airline was built on the principles of respect and dignity. Our success has come from treating every passenger, regardless of who they are or where they come from, with fairness and professionalism. Your actions today have failed those values." The cabin, silent moments earlier, erupted into applause. Passengers clapped enthusiastically, their approval of Marcus's words echoing through the space. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged glances, satisfied that Helen's actions were being addressed. Helen, however, looked mortified. Her head hung low, and her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of a service cart for balance. The applause felt like an indictment, each clap amplifying her humiliation. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but Marcus didn't give her the chance. "Effective immediately," he said, turning to the airline executives flanking him, "Miss Sanders is to be removed from duty. Her behavior does not align with the standards of this airline, and she will be held accountable." One of the executives nodded, stepping forward to address Helen. "Miss Sanders, please come with us," he said firmly. Helen's face crumpled as the reality of her dismissal set in. She glanced briefly at Ava, who met her gaze with a calm, composed expression. There was no malice in Ava's eyes, but there was also no forgiveness, only a quiet certainty that justice was being served. As Helen was escorted off the plane, passengers whispered among themselves. "She had it coming," one muttered. "You can't treat people like that and expect to get away with it," said another. Back in her seat, Ava watched the scene unfold, her emotions a mix of relief and quiet vindication. Marcus returned to her side, his presence a steadying force. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, his voice gentle. Ava nodded, her tone stronger this time. "I'm fine now. Thank you, Dad." Marcus gave her a small smile. "You never have to thank me for standing up for you," he said. "It's what I'm here for." As the plane began to empty, Ava and Marcus stood together, their bond strengthened by the events of the day. Around them, passengers continued to murmur, many casting Ava looks of admiration and respect. One of the executives nodded, stepping forward to address Helen. "Miss Sanders, please come with us," he said firmly. Helen looked around, her face a mixture of shame and desperation. She glanced briefly at Ava, who met her gaze with a calm, composed expression. There was no malice in Ava's eyes, but neither was there forgiveness, only a quiet certainty that justice was being served. As Helen was escorted off the plane, whispers rippled through the cabin. "She had it coming," one passenger muttered. "You can't treat people like that and get away with it," another added. Back in her seat, Ava watched the scene unfold, her emotions a mix of relief and quiet vindication. Marcus returned to her side, his presence a steadying force. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, his voice gentle. Ava nodded, her tone stronger than before. "I'm fine now. Thank you, Dad." Marcus gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You never have to thank me for standing up for you," he said. "It's what I'm here for." As the plane began to empty, Ava stood beside her father. The events of the day had strengthened their bond in ways neither had anticipated. Around them, passengers continued to murmur, many casting Ava looks of admiration and respect. In the weeks following the incident, Skyway Airlines wasted no time addressing what had happened. Marcus Carter, deeply committed to upholding the values his company was built on, ordered an immediate review of staff training programs. Marcus worked directly with his leadership team to implement mandatory workshops on diversity, inclusion, and respect. These sessions weren't superficial. They challenged employees to confront their biases and reflect on how their actions could affect others. Role-playing exercises and guest speakers were brought in to share real-world stories of discrimination and the lasting harm it causes. Employees were reminded that their role wasn't just to serve passengers, but to uphold the dignity and respect of everyone who boarded their planes. Meanwhile, Helen Sanders had been dismissed from her position following the incident. For weeks, she stayed away from the airline, reflecting on her actions. At first, she wrestled with feelings of embarrassment and anger, but as time passed, those emotions gave way to regret and shame. She began to realize that her behavior hadn't just been unprofessional, it had been deeply unfair, rooted in assumptions she had never questioned before. One evening, as Helen sat at her kitchen table, she opened her laptop and began typing. Her email to the airline was long and heartfelt, each word carefully chosen to convey her remorse. She apologized not just for what she had done to Ava, but for the mindset that had allowed such behavior to seem acceptable. Helen acknowledged that she had failed as a representative of the airline's values and as a human being. "I can't undo the harm I caused," she wrote, "but I am committed to learning from this and ensuring it never happens again. If given the chance, I would like to prove that I've changed." When Marcus Carter read the email, he saw sincerity in Helen's words. After discussing it with his team, they decided to give her a second chance under strict probationary terms. Helen was invited to return to work, but with a clear understanding. Her actions would be closely monitored, and any further incidents of unprofessionalism or prejudice would result in immediate dismissal. Helen returned to the airline, humbled and determined to make amends. She threw herself into the mandatory training sessions, often volunteering to speak about her own experience and how it had changed her perspective. Over time, her colleagues began to notice a transformation. Helen was no longer the flight attendant who dismissed others based on assumptions. Instead, she became someone who went out of her way to ensure that every passenger felt valued. Marcus Carter, meanwhile, used the incident as an opportunity to speak publicly. At a press conference held weeks after the flight, he addressed the media with calm yet resolute authority. "Inclusion is not optional. It's a responsibility," he began, his voice steady. "Privilege comes with responsibility, whether it's the privilege of serving as a flight attendant or the privilege of sitting in first class. We all have a duty to treat each other with respect and dignity. No one should ever feel unwelcome or unworthy because of their appearance or background." His words struck a chord, and the story quickly went viral. Social media platforms buzzed with conversations about prejudice and accountability. Hashtags like "Inclusion Matters" and "Respect for All" trended for days. Many praised Marcus's leadership and transparency, while others shared their own experiences with discrimination. The story became a springboard for broader discussions about how bias and inequality can manifest in everyday situations and what can be done to address them. The experience became a defining moment in Ava's life. Reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized how much she had learned about strength, resilience, and the importance of standing up for oneself. Her father's unwavering support had reinforced the belief that dignity and respect were non-negotiable values. She carried those lessons with her, confident they would guide her through life's challenges. Ava also witnessed the ripple effects of the incident. The airline's new training programs, the viral conversations online, and even Helen's transformation served as proof that change was possible. Though the ordeal had been painful, it had also been empowering. Weeks later, Ava and Marcus found themselves on another flight, seated side by side in first class. Ava glanced around, observing the flight crew as they worked. Their movements were smooth and professional, their smiles warm and genuine. Every interaction was respectful, free from hesitation or judgment. It was the seamless service Skyway Airlines had always been known for. One of the flight attendants approached Ava, offering her a drink with a warm smile. Ava returned the gesture with a quiet gratitude, glancing over at her father and sharing a knowing smile. This flight was a far cry from the last one, and the change was palpable. It wasn't just about the improved service. It was about the empowerment Ava felt within herself. She knew she had emerged from the experience stronger and more self-assured than ever. Leaning back in her seat, a quiet sense of satisfaction washed over her. Change wasn't always easy, but it was always worth fighting for. If you believe in standing up for fairness, equality, and respect for everyone, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. See you in the next one.